Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Paisley and I'm from London in England, and my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in West Virginia in North America in 1987 when I was 21 years old at the time. I grew up in Notting Hill in London, a single daughter of two very hard-working parents who both worked in central London as insurance brokers near Fenchurch Street. We lived in a symmetrical, aesthetically pleasing Georgian-style apartment block with the quintessential whitewashed walls, symmetrical windows and shutters. All the houses in our street reflected the same square regimental style of architecture, with pediments, arches and columns, which I believe made our area very aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Notting Hill nowadays is an up-and-coming prestigious part of London and home to a handful of celebrities, but it is still a great area for raising a family and is a thriving social interactive community, but a little on the expensive side, I have to admit. I loved growing up in Notting Hill because we were pretty much close to everything. You could walk everywhere on foot, which was wonderfully convenient. There was Kensington Gardens around the corner, where we took our mischievous wire-haired terrier Molly Moo for her daily walks. It was around a beautiful park there, with expansive green lawns and pretty trees. Then if you turned a corner, you would find Westbourne Grove, where you can find those trendy and exclusive boutiques. And then to the west is my favourite spot of all. That's where the famous Portobello Market is, where you find all those quaint little market stalls and intriguing-looking shops. And nowadays there's also a plethora of restaurants and pubs to be found in the area as well. I absolutely adored going to the markets and finding some bargains at the market store, which was personally far more exciting for me than buying clothes at a fancy-pantsy store or boutique. I always liked striking bargains with the local traders. That's part of the fun, and I enjoy that kind of shopping as it gives you that false glorified feeling that you've got something for nothing. I also loved piling my basket with fresh local produce to bring back home, like fish from the fishmonger and fresh fruit and vegetables direct from the market. It was a thriving metropolitan city to grow up in, which was lively and fun, and the people were terribly friendly and congenial, and some of the locals were real characters with a huge sense of humour. For the first few years I attended a very good local school in the area, but when my father was transferred to Edinburgh in Scotland for a short-term assignment in his job, both my parents decided it would be best to send me to boarding school for my senior years of school, which is rarely where my story begins. My boarding school was a huge red-bricked, rather attractive, imposing-looking building with large symmetrical classroom windows. It was surrounded with undulating emerald green lawns and a scattering of pretty trees on the ground. Then there was large areas of arched corridors that you would expect to find in any school, where the kids would use as a point of access to migrate from one classroom to another between lessons. Funny enough, I took to boarding school rather like a duck to water and was exceedingly quick to establish some lifelong friends. But there were the inevitable setbacks of being far away from home in Notting Hill. I missed my fun-loving parents so very much, especially my adorable dad. I also yearned for the freedom that I had when I was living in that bustling neighbourhood where there was so much to do in the thriving metropolitan community, with never a dull moment to be had. We used to have a saying in London that if you were tired of London, you were quite literally tired of life. I remember in those days at boarding school, we just adored receiving post from our loved ones, and it was always the most exciting part of the day to get a letter. The head prefect would come down to the playground where we were sitting in circles, cross-legged on the grass, having our little chats during tea break. I remember in her hand she would be carrying a large pile of post, and as she read the names out on the letters, I would always hold my breath, hoping with all my heart that there would be a letter in that large pile, especially for me, and that the prefect would invariably call out my name. If I did get a letter, it felt as thrilling and riveting as receiving a Christmas present that I could not wait to tear open. I remember my hands would literally tremble and my heart would flutter with excitement as I tore open the envelope and extracted the papery contents. I would retreat to a safe corner of the playground to read my letter, and it would be the inevitable highlight of my day. If I did not receive a letter, I remember I was so bitterly disappointed. I invariably felt as if my heart would sink, and I would look longingly at my friends who were reading their post. Truly, I felt like a dog with an empty bowl, and all the people who had received letters were having steak dinners, and I was having absolutely nothing, only staring at an empty plate like a half-starved street dog. I promise you I'm not exaggerating when I say that I would salivate over their letters and look upon their papery treasures with a touch of the green-eyed monster. You see, I grew up in the 80s era, so we did not have the sophisticated internet connections that people have today for that instant communication, and so the only way to hear from someone was either through long-distance phone calls, telegrams, or post. I assure you, receiving post was the best feeling in the entire world, and a great deal more romantic than Facebook and Twitter of today. I can assure you of that categorically, because there is something about the expectancy of receiving a letter that was so electrifying. Every day after school we were expected to spend some time in the library, either reading books or catching up on homework. One day when I was shuffling around in the library, I discovered this international magazine, which I observed at the back had a long list of names and addresses of people around the world who were looking for pen pals. The first thought that came into my mind was having a few pen pals would certainly mean a whole lot more letters for me to open, and that was a very exciting prospect indeed. I could feel that familiar fluttering of excitement rising up in my heart as I envisaged all these foreign letters being delivered to my school, all addressed to me. I could barely contain my enthusiasm as I jotted down 3 names of potential pen pals to write to. One was to a boy called Nigel Dixon from Bombay in India. I liked the sound of his name. Another was Nicholas Freeman from Wellington in New Zealand. And the final letter was to James Daniels from West Virginia in North America. Before long, all 3 young men had all replied to me, and there began my long-distance friendships with these 3 individuals who literally wrote me the most incredible, detailed and charming letters. And when I say incredible, I mean literally pages of really interesting stories, all about their extraordinary lives. Before long, I was the envy of all my girlfriends who couldn't understand why I was receiving such exotic-looking mail, and were very envious of the vast streams of post flowing my way like a gushing current of beautiful paper envelopes from very exciting places abroad with very intriguing postal stamps. I warmed to all of my pen pals almost immediately and enjoyed receiving their enthralling letters. Nigel Dixon was a scuba diver in India. Nicholas Freeman was obsessed with rugby and wanted to play for the New Zealand team one day. But it was my friendship with James Daniels that seems to take on a romantic twist in this papery world of global interaction. I was to realise that we had so many interests in common, and his letters were always so funny and articulate. James lived in West Virginia in an exquisite farmhouse surrounded by beautiful, ravishing views, and he spent so much of his time hunting, fishing and exploring. Every time I received a letter from James, my friends would tell me that my skin would flush a bright pink colour and my blue eyes would light up like a Christmas tree, and I would wear a besotted puppy dog expression on my face. Before long, James and I exchanged photographs, and I really adored the look of the rugged young gentleman with the curly dark hair and the sultry-looking hazel eyes that I saw smiling back at me in the photographs. I would tell my girlfriends that I was falling for James, who was about 2 years my senior. I told them that I was certain that he was the man for me. My friends would tell me that I was in love with the idea of love, and I couldn't possibly fall for someone that I'd actually never met before. They expressed that I was just being big, soppy, incurable romantic that literally believed in fairy tales. They were telling me that sadly life wasn't like that, and you'll probably find that he's the biggest tosser when you do actually finally get to meet him. I knew in my gut that they were very, very wrong. One day James urged me to fly from the United Kingdom to America and come to West Virginia to spend a couple of weeks with his family in their idyllic countryside home. I begged my dad to let me go, and usually my dad had a tendency to give in to me, as he always referred to me as his blue-eyed girl, so it wasn't surprising for me when he agreed to my eager request. I still remember the day that James collected me from the airport. He was standing there with this massive bouquet of stunning-looking flowers in his hands, and when I went through to arrivals with my trolley, I saw him glancing in my direction with a huge, engaging smile on his face. I remember my heart was pounding like a heavy drum, and adrenaline was coursing through my veins with an exuberant anxiety. This was the moment I'd been longing for a very long time, and now it was finally happening. It was almost too good to be true. The moment we saw each other, we literally ran into each other's arms, as if we'd known each other all our lives. It was weird, but I expected to feel shy and rather reticent, but the excitement of seeing him overcame all my inhibitions, and even though we'd never articulated it in words, from that point on, we were very definitely a couple. It was unequivocally love at first sight, and James also told me that as cynical as he had always been about falling in love with someone over a pen and paper, it most assuredly had happened to him long before he even met me. "It was in your second letter you wrote to me," he said, "when you revealed that you and your best friend had sneakily slipped some green dye into your matron's hairspray bottle when she wasn't looking. Once she'd finished preening herself with lashings of hairspray, she was seen walking around the school with bright green hair, and the headmistress said, 'Mrs. Gwen, I do not know why you think such a hair colour is appropriate for a school of our standing, but it looks positively ridiculous on a woman of your advancing years. And you've made a ridiculous spectacle of yourself this morning. All the kids are sniggering and laughing at your expense. What on earth possessed you to dye your hair such a luminescent, atrocious colour? God only knows. I would be very much obliged if you would kindly revert back to your original blonde colour, which, if I may say, was a lot more becoming on you.' When the matron rushed to the bathrooms to see what the headmistress was actually talking about, and regarded her horrifying luminescent green hair in the mirror, her mortified screams could be heard all over the school and down every corridor, and after that your matron became known as Mrs. Greengwen, and the name just stuck." "That's right," I said. "Did you like that story?" "Oh, I loved it. In that moment I knew you were the one for me. You're mischievous, and I really like that a lot. Apart from anything else," he continued, "you're much more beautiful than your picture, but then everything about you is gorgeous, from your cute little upturned nose and to the dimples around your cheeks when you smile." I have to say that I also found James to be much more handsome in the flesh than in his photograph. I loved his mop of curly dark hair and his beautiful hazel eyes, not to mention his large ravishing smile that would make my heart miss a beat every time. Naturally, I was delighted to meet James's entire family, and they were the warmest people with such an easygoing attitude to life that I found incredibly endearing and very charming. They welcomed me into their home as if I was already part of their family, and went out of their ways to be extraordinarily hospitable towards me. James lived on a large, sumptuous property in a very rural, large 1800s-style farmhouse with exquisite mountainous views, rocky ridges, rolling green countryside, an exquisite silvery lake, ponds, several rustic-looking barns, and then vast areas of natural woods that consisted primarily of red and chestnut oaks, sugar maples, American beeches, hickory and white walnut trees. Even better, the thriving woods on his property was teeming with indigenous wildlife, such as groundhogs, cottontail rabbits, squirrels, skunks, red foxes, chipmunks, raccoons, and my favourite of all, the very serene, ever so gentle white-tailed deer. I was also taken by James's family on many occasions to visit the picturesque town of Bridgeport for some fine dining opportunities, and also to visit some of the artsy and rather trendy curio shops there, where James brought me a heart-shaped locket, which I still have today, with a picture of the two of us inside when we first met. One day when James was working night shift in Bridgeport, helping his uncle with running their family restaurant, I was pretty much left to my own devices. James' parents had been invited to a barbecue with friends, and they urged me to come along. In truth, I just wanted some space to myself, so I encouraged them to just please go to the party without me. I've always enjoyed my own space, so it felt very good to be on my own. I decided to go and pick some walnuts from the walnut tree very late in the afternoon. I made my way to the wooded area with a basket clasped in my hands. I'd never been into the woods before, and I was actually amazed that James hadn't taken me in here yet. It was such an exquisite area, filled with large, tall, imposing trees, which were like statuesque green giants, rising up in the firmament, and they were so old that all I could see was their very solid bark-like foundations, because even the lower branches seemed to tower above me at a great height. This cooling canopy the trees created was like a vast umbrella above my head, but there were areas between the branches where the sunlight filtered through, creating pretty prisms of light that danced on the creeping ground cover below. I noticed that these woods were very well maintained, because there were distinct man-made earthen pathways everywhere, especially for hiking, I imagine. And then there were ferns and pretty cascading undergrowth that created a soft green carpet on the ground. I also loved the way the green moss literally clung to the tree branches like a very tactile, furry green wallpaper. It was utterly enchanting and very mesmerising. I also realised to my amazement that I could actually hear the sound of water cascading through the woods, and I could feel the gentle wet spray shower my face in a fresh mist. I ascertained that there must be a waterfall close by, and I was right. I watched in awe as the foaming white water cascaded down these sculptural rocky heights to the lower stream that then ultimately meandered through the woods. There were no words to describe how breathtaking it all was. The forest was alive with pretty birdsong, and I can honestly say that I literally danced through those woods because it was such an incredible privilege to be surrounded by such exquisite scenery that quite literally took my breath away. Suddenly I saw a white-tailed deer who was chewing its cud and twitching its tail, and for a moment I stood very still as I watched in awe, but after a while it scampered away. As I reached the white walnut trees, I discovered a very large deerskin on the ground that was filled with walnuts, which surprised me because if this was private property, which I gathered it was, what on earth were all these walnuts doing in this animal pelt, I wondered. I was a little concerned that there might just be a stranger or trespasser around. I decided I would take the walnuts and the skin and place them in my own basket, as after all they did belong to James's family and not to some trespasser on the land. At that very moment a huge form stepped out of the undergrowth, and I was so startled that I was unable to scream. I just stood there in silence, with my mouth wide open in shock. I noticed that the creature was very colossal in size. It was a humanoid in appearance, covered in long, flowing brown hair. It really rather reminded me of those pictures you see of early man, as he invariably evolves from an ape to a human, sort of in between that. I think the thing that really stunned me the most was the sheer titanic proportions of this great mighty beast. I would say he was about 900 pounds, 8 foot tall and 4 foot wide, with very overlong arms, powerful, strong legs, and human-like, very large hands and feet. I could tell that the critter was built like an army tank, because he was solid, brawny, sinewy and muscular, and those humongous shoulders of his were nothing to be sneezed at. The creature had a cone-shaped head, and a very angular pointed face, and I noticed deep-set treacle-brown eyes, a very flat nose, and an exceedingly thin mouth. It made a low, guttural warning growl at me that sounded rather like a dog protecting his bone from a challenger, and then it grabbed my basket from me and pulled all the walnuts back into his animal skin. This was when I realised suddenly that the creature was not happy that I'd actually swiped his walnuts. I wanted to make up for my transgression, so I proceeded to pick some nuts off the ground and put them back into the animal skin as a way of saying, "Sorry for pinching your stash," to the strange creature. When he saw that I was gathering nuts for him off the ground, the creature actually looked rather pleased, and the former aggression that he had displayed towards me suddenly just dissipated. The creature squatted under the tree, eating the walnuts by popping them in his mouth happily like a box of popcorn, once he had of course extracted them from their shell, which he prized open effortlessly with his thick fingers. The creature watched me hunched over on my falls, gathering the nuts for him and placing them into the animal skin. He seemed very jubilant to let me do all the hard work for him, while he took it very easy, snacking under the tree and watching me with rather interested eyes. I surreptitiously reached into the animal skin to eat a walnut that I'd noticed had fallen out of its shell, and the animal snatched it from my hand and stuffed it greedily into his mouth. He looked at me with an animated expression on his face as if to say, "That's mine, not yours, and I'm definitely not sharing." His expression was so comical that I actually had to laugh out loud. When I'd finished gathering my contribution of walnuts for the hairy critter, he got up and shook the walnut tree incredibly hard with his overlong arms that seemed like hailstones of walnuts were suddenly falling off the tree and carpeting the entire ground. The creature pointed at the ground and his animal skin as if to say, "Get the rest for me." I giggled. "Sorry, I've done my part," I said. "You want them? You pick them up yourself," I said. The creature pointed to the ground, making an indignant chattering sound, and then he threw me a walnut to eat. I think he decided that giving me a small quota of walnuts might actually mean I'd do all the dirty work for him and gather all the fallen nuts off the ground. I fell for the creature's manipulative tactics and gathered the rest of the nuts for him, but to give him his dues, he did dutifully put some of the fallen nuts into my basket as some kind of restitution for me. The creature patted the ground as if encouraging me to sit down near him, which I did, and then he tossed me a few of the walnuts that he'd cracked open, and we sat there eating for a while together as the afternoon faded and the dusk finally rolled in. In the distance I could hear the hoot of an owl, and to my absolute amazement the creature made a very similar owl hoot back, as though returning a call. He then gathered his nuts together in the deerskin, and he bound it together in his hands like a large bag. The critter nodded in my direction quickly, as if he was saying cheerio, and then he glided back into the forest with such a seamless grace. I could hardly believe what I'd just seen. For a long time I had absolutely no idea what in fact the critter was that I'd encountered, and even though I did describe it very clearly to James's family, they all thought I'd encountered a bear. But when I assured them that I'd gathered nuts for the creature, they were more than a little perturbed as to what the hairy humanoid could actually be, because they'd never, ever seen something like that before. It was only later on in my life, after James and I were married with children of our own, that I observed a programme on television all about Bigfoots, and I was exceedingly excited to tell James that this was indeed the creature that I'd encountered in the woods on his parents' land. I gathered from the footage that the Bigfoots are elusive and reticent creatures, and it appears many of them are quite aggressive and very frightening. I do not recall being afraid of the Bigfoot that I encountered, but that was because he was like a giant human covered in hair that was really very congenial towards me. That was after the first hint of aggression. I do know that if he had been very aggressive to me, it would have been a terrifying interaction because of his sheer size. I'm only glad I encountered a friendly boy who was a little on the lazy side and really rather possessive over the walnuts. To be honest, I really quite warmed to the hairy critter, and I was only sad that I never got to see him again. I hope he's still out there, though, pilfering walnuts and getting his miners to gather them for him, while he sits back enjoying the high life. As you've gathered by my story, I did subsequently marry the man of my dreams, and we are now happily living in West Virginia in a delightful farmhouse ourselves, so all the doubters and sceptics from my boarding school years who believed that it was impossible to fall in love with your pen pal just from writing letters to each other, you were very wrong. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Kathy and I'm from Arlington Ridge in West Virginia, and my Bigfoot encounter happened to me and also to my mother, Paula, in 2016. At the time I was about 18 years old and my mother was 42. I was born and raised in the historic neighbourhood of Arlington Ridge, which is quite literally minutes away from the dining and nightlife of Washington, D.C. My family reside in a very quiet, slow-paced, rather serene, leafy green suburb, where we live in a very attractive colonial rectangular-shaped red-bricked home that is set quite a way back from the street itself, with large symmetrical windows and a central wooden white front door. Our home has a very pretty terraced manicured garden full of colourful blooms in the front yard, and our backyard has a kidney-shaped swimming pool and a sumptuous entertainment area which is surrounded by large rolling green lawn and a scattering of fruit trees. My father works in the Arlington area for a well-established automobile company, and my mother works mornings 3 times a week showing around potential buyers the exhibits for a local art gallery. My rather strange and peculiar story begins when my family had been invited to an outdoor prestigious wedding venue in an exquisite rural retreat that was surrounded by dreamy forests, rolling green West Virginian countryside, silvery lakes, ponds and statuesque mountains. It was an idyllic part of the world. My cousin Jennifer was actually getting married and had requested my mother to be a maid of honour at the event and for me to be one of the 7 bridesmaids. As you can imagine, as is invariably the case with every bride, cousin Jennifer wanted absolutely nothing to go wrong for her special day. She had told me that on a recent trip to Singapore, she had discovered the perfect lilac satin that she wanted to use for her bridesmaids and maids of honour outfits, and so subsequently she phoned everyone, asking them for their dress measurements and sizes about 6 months prior to the wedding day, as Jennifer was an exceptionally organised and efficient person. Fast forward to about 6 weeks before the wedding day, and the postman delivered a large box for us from Jennifer. It contained my mother's outfit, which was a skirt and a tunic-style top, and mine, which was a bridesmaid's dress. "These are the outfits for Jennifer's wedding," I cried out in delight as I opened the door, holding the big box in my hand. "It's arrived!" gasped my mother in delight. "I'm dying to see what the outfit looks like." My father shook his head with amusement as he sat on the settee, watching my mother and I behaving like 2 excited kids, unwrapping their Christmas presents. We both dived into our individual wrapped boxes and untied the large lilac ribbons as hastily as we could. We both knew that if these outfits were indeed designed by Jennifer, that they were going to be incredibly stylish, classic and smart, because Jennifer had phenomenal taste. I opened the tissue paper and removed the delicate, very snazzy dress from the folds of paper, and I gasped in awe at the extravagant lilac material with the exquisite gold embroidery. It was such a sophisticated style of dress that I knew that I could enjoy it for many other occasions in the future, because it was such a classic design and did not look like a quintessential bridesmaid's dress, but more like a work of art. "Oh, Mum," I sighed, "look how gorgeous my dress is," I said, holding it up against my body. "I can't wait to try it on." My mother unfolded her incredibly snazzy skirt and tunic from the tissue paper. She excitedly removed her bridal outfit that looked incredibly stunning with its beautiful gold embroidery on the collar and, of course, on the bottom of the skirt as well. My mother let out a huge gasp. "It's stunning," she said. "So sophisticated and elegant," she cried out in delight. My mother and I began to try on our outfits very eagerly, and while my mother could put the skirt on, she could not pull the zipper up because she had put on way too much weight since she was measured 6 months prior. She looked absolutely mortified. "What am I going to do?" she wailed. "I can't fit into this little pokey thing. Why on earth did Jennifer make this wretched thing so tight? I feel like a hippopotamus bursting at the seams." I realised in horror that I was also unable to pull the zipper up all the way on my dress, because it appeared that I had also surreptitiously piled on the pounds, unbeknown to me. How on earth had this happened? It was as if the universe was telling me what I already knew. I did not want to confront something I'd been willfully denying for far too long, and now the truth was hitting me so hard, like a violent blow to the face. Kathy, you're just too fat. I stared in horror in the mirror at the unwanted bulges that had sneakily crept up around my middle in the dead of night when I wasn't looking. It just wasn't fair. My mother was looking at herself in the mirror with an expression of disgusted revulsion on her face, and was in far worse shape than me, as the bulges of extra adipose tissue were not cooperating with her outfit that she so badly wanted to wear. And unfortunately the tunic top did not conceal the open zipper, so everything was hanging out, and it was far from pretty. "What's wrong?" asked my tall, slender father, entering the room. "Why such disheartened expressions on your faces?" he inquired. "A moment ago you were ecstatic as you were opening your brand new outfits, but now you both look as if you're about to attend a funeral. I thought you were both excited about your cousin's wedding." "I would be," said my mother, "if I could get this pathetic zipper up on this skirt. How can I go to the wedding looking like this? I can't understand how I've put on so much weight in such a short period of time. It's horrifying." My father began to crack up laughing as he saw us struggling with our zippers. "My two beluga whales," he chuckled. "I love you, both rolls and all." "That's not funny, Peter," my mother chastised him. "It's all right for you being able to eat everything you want without picking up a gram of weight. Look at me," she said, stroking her extended stomach. "I have the most terrible, terrible metabolism, and I look like I'm expecting triplets, never mind twins." "I'm not sure that's true, sweetheart," laughed my father. "You eat twice as much as I do, and lately you've been going through tubs of your favourite chocolate chip ice cream, as if there was no tomorrow. What about all that pizza you always consume? Not to mention those Chinese takeouts." "What are you saying, Peter?" said my mother, looking at him with a furious expression on her face. "Are you telling me that I'm a pig?" "No, of course not, darling," chuckled my father. "But maybe if you cut back a little bit on the ice cream for a start, you might just lose a little more weight." My mother looked at my father with an expression of unadulterated horror. "If you open your mouth and say another word, I will kill you," she said to my dad. "Mum," I said, "this is very serious. We can't go to the wedding with our zips like this. Can you imagine how humiliating that would be? We'll be the butt of everybody's jokes at the wedding, and Jennifer will be absolutely gutted if our wedding outfits ruin her photographs." My mother examined the clothes very closely, but she realised that the outfits could not be extended in any way, and we could not get them remade by a great dressmaker because the fabric wasn't available in this country, nor could we get such meticulous embroidery done at such short notice. It really was a bummer, and we only had 6 weeks to rectify the damage that already had been done. "We've got 6 weeks left," said my mother. "We're going to have to starve ourselves to death before the wedding day. The last thing I feel like doing is being a rabbit for 6 long weeks, but I guess I've got no choice in the matter. I have to force myself to lose this weight." She proceeded to go into the kitchen to ruthlessly throw out all the tempting treats in our cupboards into a large bin bag. "Why are you throwing them away?" I asked my mother. "Isn't it such a waste?" "Kathy," said my mother in a very determined voice, "we cannot have any temptation in our midst. We have to eliminate it all from our lives, lest we should be tempted. This is the first thing they do on those diet programs on television, and that is to get rid of the calorific treats. We have no choice in the matter if we want to be successful." For the next couple of days my mother and I were utterly miserable as we sat at the table with our tiny plates carpeted with broccoli and a touch of steamed chicken breasts, while we watched my dad enviously scoffing a plate of delicious macaroni cheese in front of us, as if it was no big deal. It got worse. He proceeded to go to the freezer and help himself to a large helping of salted caramel ice cream, which he topped with mini marshmallows and chocolate sauce. "Right, I've had just about enough," said my mother, eyeing my dad's meal like a salivating dog that couldn't take it a moment longer. She picked up her cell phone to call our Chinese takeaway place. "I can't sit back. watching your dad eating melt-in-the-mouth mac and cheese, and I'm eating war-sized rations of the most putrid green muck," she explained. "Yes, I'd like some sweet and sour chicken. Yes, spring rolls, rice, that's right," she said. "That's right." "Mum," I said in horror, "what about your diet? You're never going to fit into your outfit if you keep scoffing Chinese takeouts. There's not much time left for the wedding. You need to lose the weight fast." "Look, darling," said my mother, "I'm starving hungry right now," she said. "If I don't eat something more substantial, I'm going to fade away, and then I won't be able to attend your cousin's wedding anyway. I'll start the diet tomorrow, I promise." I'm afraid to admit that my worst fears were finally confirmed. As every day went by, my mother started her day with very good intentions in regards to her diet, and appeared motivated and very disciplined. But by dinner time she was so starved that she'd sneakily order pizzas and Chinese takeouts when nobody was looking. I would actually observe her creeping out of the house at all hours of the night, and she would surreptitiously drive somewhere, and when she returned home she seemed a lot more chirpy and upbeat. I was to discover all the kinds of wrappers, from chocolate bars, empty ice cream containers, pizza boxes and Chinese takeouts that she had brought and eaten in the car, while hiding the startling evidence under her front seat. She had not fooled me, but every time I confronted her with my findings in regards to her secret scoffing sessions, she would assure me that the diet would definitely begin tomorrow. But invariably tomorrow never ever came, as is often the case with most diets. I'm very glad to inform you that I did manage to stick to my broccoli and chicken diet and overcome all the temptations that came my way, so the weight did fall off me very fast. But in my mother's case, she gained even more weight during the 6-week period. The day before the wedding, my mother was faced with a grim reality that the zipper of her skirt was not going to slide up, and worse still, the skirt had become even tighter. "This horrible, horrible skirt," my mother protested. "It's so tight around my thighs, I can barely walk. I feel like a sausage dog stuffed in a tight sock. This isn't funny. I think I'm going to burst out of the skirt on the dance floor in the wedding. What on earth am I going to do?" My father chuckled with amusement when he saw my mother pulling her stomach in as hard as she could to prise up the stubborn zipper, but to no avail, as the zipper just refused to budge. "It's too tight on you, darling," said my dad. "You look ridiculous, like a sausage bursting out of its skin. You can't possibly wear that. I think you should buy a dress of a similar colour for the wedding. I'm sure Jennifer will understand." "I cannot do that, Peter," snapped my mother. "I can't let Jennifer down. She's gone to all this trouble getting this dress made for me. I'll buy a long lilac cardigan to cover the back of the skirt, to conceal the open zipper." "Are you sure that will work?" asked my dad. "It'll just have to," sighed my mother. "But Mum," I protested, "what if it's too hot for you to wear a cardigan?" "Well, I'll just have to bite the bullet and deal with it," said my mother. Fast forward to the wedding day, and it really was a beautiful, charming outdoor event, and things couldn't have gone better for Jennifer. It was a sweltering hot day, and my mother really suffered with the steamy conditions in her lilac cardigan, and I also noticed she was struggling to walk because her skirt was so tight around her thighs she could barely make a step. "I can hardly breathe," she whispered to me during the ceremony. "This skirt is sucking the life out of me, and I'm sweating like a pig. I feel like I'm going to pass out and faint," she said, patting the beads of perspiration off her forehead with a tissue. Before long, we'd eaten a delectable 5-course meal and listened to the long, drawn-out, rather boring wedding speeches, until finally the guests were invited to dance on a portable black-and-white dance floor set up on the grass while the DJ played the music. "Come and dance," said my dad, whisking my mother off her feet onto the dance floor. I sat at the table watching my parents arm in arm dancing together, and I was just thinking what an incredibly lovely couple they made, when I suddenly realised, to my alarm, that my mother's skirt had ripped open on the dance floor and was sliding down her legs, revealing her large pair of white knickers. I'm sure I actually heard someone snigger and laugh, and I raced up to the dance floor to rescue my mother from this brutal humiliation. "Oh no," I thought, Please, God, no! I raced up to my mother and whispered, "Follow me now, and hold your skirt up. It's falling off you. Everybody can see your undies." My mother tottered after me, holding up her skirt in her hands, as some guest looked curiously in our direction, as if to say, "What on earth is going on there?" My mother and I quickly made our way to a densely wooded area, far from the wedding crowd. "What are we going to do?" said my mother, stepping out of her skirt and holding it into the air to examine it. "Oh, I've gone and ripped the entire thing to shreds," she said. "What are we going to do now?" "We're going to leave," I told her. "I'll phone Dad on my cell phone and tell him to meet us at the back road in his car. If we go through the wooded area, the back road is on the other side. I'll get Dad to tell Jennifer that we took you home because you had a dicky tummy." "Very well," said my mother. "I suppose we don't have any other options. I can hardly return to the venue wearing a short top and a pair of knickers, can I?" I arranged for my dad to meet us at the back road and told him that we were walking through the forest to avoid being seen or observed by any of the wedding guests. "It's such a relief being in here," said my mother. "It's so lovely and cool and refreshing, and I feel free now that I've got that ghastly tightly skirt off. This must be how a snake feels once it's eliminated its old skin." The forest was exquisitely beautiful, and I know of no words to describe it other than to say it quite literally took my breath away. I could see that this dreamy forest was superbly maintained, with clear hiking trails, and although I'd been here before, it was much more exquisite than I last remembered it. I noticed that the moss-covered trees were easily over 300 years old, with the most gigantic-sized trunks I've ever observed. They towered into the blue sky like statuesque green giants, and their outstretched branches created an amazing canopy above our heads that allowed just enough sunlight to dapple the forest floor in pretty prisms of soft light. Even the ground was covered in delicate green creeping foliage and ground covers such as ferns and ivies, and it was just so incredibly pretty. The bird calls in the forest, from the whistles to the warbles and tweets, were equally as charming, and it felt so good to be close to nature. I took off my heels and walked bare feet across the path, enjoying the feeling of the freedom that my feet felt escaping the confines of my tight, uncomfortable shoes. A couple of adorable squirrels eyed us curiously with bright, beady brown eyes as they darted from one tree to another like a mischievous pair of furry gymnasts, and it would seem that my mother and I startled several very gentle-looking white-tailed deers that looked at us in alarm and scuttled away in a fervent hurry. Suddenly we heard a whistling sound, and that was when I instructed my mother to hide, because I could tell that someone was definitely coming, and I didn't want them to see my mother in her humiliating state of undress. "Quick, hide," I said, pushing my mother behind the girth of a very large oak tree. As the person moved towards us, his footsteps sounded very heavy, almost like that of a huge, hefty animal. The whistling continued, and that was when my mother and I laid our eyes on the mythical creature called Bigfoot. I literally could not believe what I was viewing, because until this very second in time, I'd always believed Bigfoot to be a creature of fantasy or fiction. Now we were seeing him, larger than life, literally standing yards away from us. I could barely believe it. I've heard them describe Bigfoot in documentaries before as big, but this creature went beyond big. It was colossal, so much so that it was well in line with a hippo or a rhino. He had those kind of burly, bulky, powerful, strong proportions, but in a humanoid shape or form. Every part of this creature's body was gargantuan, yet at the same time streamlined and built for power, speed, agility, and grace. I could tell that this imposing, impressive beast possessed very evident human-like characteristics, but also exhibited a profound resemblance to the great ape in many ways. In particular, its overlong arms, which I imagined enabled the creature to swing on the branches much like a orangutan, or run on all fours like a monkey. I imagined that even its Goliath proportions and extensive girth would not impair its ability to climb and swing on trees, because I think the Bigfoots are so agile, I'm pretty certain they can balance out their weight with effortless ease so that they don't break the tree branches beneath them. I could, of course, be very wrong. The Bigfoot appeared to be covered with human-like hair, and definitely not fur. I actually have a friend with long strawberry blonde hair, and his hair was very similar to hers, only of course much more tangled and matted, but it was very beautiful in colour and texture like hers is. I also observed that this Bigfoot had the hugest, very defined muscular shoulders that I've actually ever seen, and it had a distinctive bullet-shaped head and an angular face with a very furrowed, wrinkled forehead, a grey leathery skin, and very deep-set golden brown eyes. The Bigfoot continued to whistle happily to himself, and then to my absolute amazement and surprise, he actually picked up my mother's shredded skirt that was lying on the footpath. He picked it up and smelt it, and studied the fabric in his hands, and seemed to appreciate its beauty and soft sheen, as he rubbed his sausage-like fingers across the fabric, and made an enthused grunting sound. He kept smelling the skirt intently, and I could tell that he approved of the female pheromones that he could detect. I'm almost certain from that the creature was male, and enjoyed smelling my mother's female scent. He rolled up the fabric under his arms, looking quite jubilant with his finding, and then glided down the forest path, whistling very happily to himself. I'm only grateful that he didn't observe us, as I do not know how he would have reacted if he had. In truth, I think I would have freaked out if he'd seen me, because the creature was just so powerful, strong, and exceedingly intimidating. "Oh, my goodness," whispered my mother so excitedly, with eyes as wide as saucers. "We've just seen Bigfoot! Do you realise what a monumental deal that is? And we saw him really close up. I can hardly believe it." I was unable to say a thing, as I trembled in shock. I felt a combination of awe and sheer terror from what we'd just observed. "Did you see how big he was?" asked my mother. "I feel skinny next to that creature," she giggled. "He was gargantuan and very tall. He must have easily been over 1,000 pounds, 9 foot tall, and at a rough estimate about 4 foot wide. He was so beautiful, Mum, don't you think?" "Oh, there's no doubt about that," my mother reflected. "He was magnificent and inspirational, in much the same way as any impressive apex predator like a lion or tiger. Oh, yes, he possessed a very powerful, majestic presence. Of that there is no doubt." Finally we made our way through the forest, where my dad was waiting impatiently for us at the car. "What took you so long?" he asked. "I've been waiting here for quite some time." "We got a little waylaid," I explained, not wishing to talk about our strange encounter, as I was naturally processing everything that I'd observed in my mind and trying to make sense of it all. "I did what you said," said my father. "I told Jennifer that your mum had a dicky tummy and needed to come home, and she understood. She said she did think your mother looked a little peaky and off colour, wearing a cardigan in the scorching heat." Fast forward a few weeks, and my mother and I did finally tell our dad about our Bigfoot encounter once we'd processed it all ourselves. Even though he believed our extraordinary account, he urged us not to tell anyone about our experience for fear of ridicule and disbelief. In a strange way, I'm rather grateful that my mother humiliated herself by bursting out of her wedding outfit. Otherwise we'd never have made that hasty escape through those woods, nor would we have encountered the hairy critter known as Bigfoot. When Jennifer asked me what I actually thought of her wedding, I told her it was the best day of my entire life. She was thrilled when I told her that. It was not, of course, due to the lavish affair, on which no expense had been spared, but rather because of the chance encounter that we had with the hairy man, otherwise known as Bigfoot, that did not cost a penny at all, other than a shredded-up skirt and a little bit of embarrassment. My mother is still battling the bulge and the challenge of overcoming the temptations of Chinese takeout, but she's always quick to point out that Bigfoot makes her feel very skinny, and she's even placed a Bigfoot picture on the fridge to remind her of that fact. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Bree, and I grew up in the exquisite rural location of the Pacific Northwest that is very well renowned for its breathtaking scenery of mountainous outcrops, rolling emerald green valleys, and very pretty pasture land, not to mention silvery lakes, and let's not forget those dreamy forests of statuesque tall trees that tower up into the heavens like masterful giants. My Bigfoot encounter did not happen to me, but to my grandmother in the 60s here in the Pacific Northwest. My mother related this incredible, fabulous story to me shortly after my grandmother died in 1973, when she was killed very mysteriously crossing the road to attend her regular weekly appointment at the beauty salon. Suddenly, an unknown, rather obscure, very mysterious black car with no license plates and blacked-out windows zipped through the zebra crossing at an accelerated speed and ran over my grandmother, killing her instantly. At the time, many bewildered onlookers and startled pedestrians screamed out in horror to witness such a gruesome, unholy scene unfolding before their very eyes, and they described what they had seen as being a deliberate hit-and-run by an insidious driver who seemed intent on mowing my grandmother down. As is often the case in road traumas like this, nothing was ever established or proved, and the perpetrator of this grisly, deplorable crime was unfortunately never identified. So sadly, my grandmother's tragic, untimely passing was invariably described as a tragic, unfortunate accident. After my grandmother's cataclysmic death, more signs were actually placed up near that zebra crossing, reminding drivers to give pedestrians the right of way and to drive carefully. The story I'm about to share with you is quite some story that I do believe that your listeners may find very entertaining. I don't know much about my grandmother's early life in the 40s when America got caught up in World War II, but I do know that once the 50s emerged, it was a prosperous, booming time for American families, and my grandmother's family rose to the occasion and chose to prosper and bloom during this post-war period under the leadership of Dwight Eisenhower. My grandmother was a very cheerful, bubbly and lively woman who was exceedingly congenial and always saw the bright and funny side to life. As she was very portly and well-rounded, she wore those large flowery dresses with lots and lots of beads, and I gather always smelt of talcum powder and lavender soap. She was an attractive, jovial woman with a long head of blonde shoulder-length hair, a round face, peachy skin, and very sparkling blue eyes. Her husband was her polar opposite and was tall and lanky like a flagpole, and was so quiet and introverted that he barely ever spoke a word, and would only ever acknowledge you with a curt, brisk nod. If anyone asked him a question, my grandmother swooped to the rescue like an eagle rescuing a falling eaglet from the sky, and she would answer your question for him on his behalf. I'm not sure whether his reticence was due to antisocial behaviour or whether he was just painfully shy. I sincerely hope the latter was the case. While my grandmother loved all things sweet and sickly, her husband invariably loved all things salty and savoury, and despite their many peculiar differences, they rarely made a staunch, sound, very solid and happy couple. In the early 50s, my grandparents both ran a thriving dairy business that became so incredibly profitable and successful that by the early 60s my grandmother started her very own sweet shop in the local town. This had been my grandmother's lifelong inspirational dream since she was a tiny little girl, and now finally it had budded, blossomed and grown roots. So it came to pass that one beautiful summer's morning in the early 60s, in a very small rural town in the Pacific Northwest, a brand new sweet shop opened its doors to the public and took the entire town by storm. Such was the awesome reputation of my grandmother's shop that people from far afield came from all over America to buy my grandmother's candies, many that were exclusively made only for her shop, and she had been the pioneer of some of those incredible new flavours. Outside the stunning candy shop was a large, colourful pink, white and red striped awning with a curly sign that read Candy Queen on it. The seamless floor-to-ceiling gleaming shop windows were visually quite bewitching. You could observe hundreds of large glass jars filled with the most colourful sweets that you've ever seen in your life on show, and they sat there perfectly on these large white shelves, all beautifully labelled, forming perfect neat lines. And then there were, of course, baskets of sweets and pretty tins, bottles and boxes of candies adorned in colourful bows for gifts on those special occasions. There were delectable bottles attractively presented containing different fudges from chocolate to vanilla, aniseed balls, jelly sweets made in all kinds of interesting shapes, bubble gums, treacle, caramel and butterscotch toffees, sherbets, gummy sweets, pixie dust, marshmallow fish, candy cigarettes, sweet necklaces, fruit chews, lemon heads, now not later banana and fruit chews, Swedish fish, half-dollar chocolates, atomic fireballs, rhubarb and custard rock candies, coconut wheels, and the list goes on and on and on. The kids in this local bustling community loved nothing better than to spend their pennies on candies, and in those days a few pennies could invariably buy you quite a lot of the yummy stuff. The kids would scurry away from my grandmother's shop with animated expressions on their young jubilant faces as they peered eagerly through the contents of the pink and white bag that they had just purchased. They would stuff their drooling open mouths with jellyfish and long sticks of heavenly licorice twists, or bite away at the sweets on a candy necklace. For a young kid, my grandmother's shop was like heaven on earth. My grandmother soon acquired the name Miss Lollipop, as she always stood behind the old-fashioned cash register with a lollipop stick dangling out of her mouth, and so the name eventually just stuck, because her sweet tooth seemed to mean that she was guilty of raiding her own sweet jars almost as much as all the kids that frequented her shop did. So powerful was her sweet tooth that she was known to go to parties and eat virtually no savouries on offer and return to the pudding cart over and over again, with bowls overflowing with cream caramel, chocolate mousse and tons of ice cream. One day my grandmother was outwitted by a couple of cunning, mischievous young boys in the town who artfully pretended that poor little Tommy Briggs had subsequently fallen over and scraped his knee very badly and was in a very poor way indeed. "Mrs. Lollipop," said one of the wily boys, "Tommy's fallen off the tree and hurt his knee very, very badly. Please come now." My grandmother's cumbersome rounded form went wobbling out of the shop as fast as she could, with her first aid kit clasped tightly in her hands, to attend to poor little Tommy's wounds. "What did you do to yourself, Tommy?" she asked, as she started to pat off the red blood from the huge red gash on his knee, and she dabbed it with cotton wool and plenty of disinfectant. "I fell and hurt my knee," said Tommy, reassuring my grandmother that it really was terribly sore, as he guilefully put on a very exaggerated pained expression on his face and kept saying, "Ouch! It hurts! It hurts!" When my grandmother gently removed all the blood away, she realised that little Tommy Briggs had not even broken open the skin on his knees, and that she'd been dabbing away vast amounts of tomato ketchup that had been cleverly made to look like blood. As you can imagine, she wasn't too pleased, and scolded Tommy for his unacceptable, mischievous behaviour. "Away with you, Tommy Briggs," she chastised him. "That was a very naughty thing to do." When she returned to her sweet shop, she discovered to her amazement that the jars of sweets had all been raided by a bunch of naughty, mischievous, very enthusiastic, rambunctious kids who had helped themselves and smuggled away some generous amounts of candy in their pockets. The whole shop was littered with bottles of open glass jars that had been seriously pilferaged and dipped into by lots of very eager small hands. My grandmother chuckled to herself, as she had a good sense of humour and knew what it was like to be a kid with a huge passion for candy. It had been a good cunning prank, and she'd fallen for it hook, line and sinker, but rest assured next time she wasn't going to be so gullible or so easily deceived when a wily young child came into the shop with some tall story to lure her away from her premises so that they could surreptitiously acquire for themselves a huge stash of candy. That wasn't going to happen again. My grandmother's shop was located on a rural street next to a large hair salon on one side and a baker on the other. At the rear of the shop was a large dirt clearing, flanked by a vast area of dreamy national forest that literally stretched back for miles. It was filled with magnificent, mature, statuesque-looking trees, from log-hole pines to Douglas firs, redwoods and sakila trees. From my research that I've done, I gather that this area of forest no longer exists today, as it has been extended into a large shopping area, which is very sad. One day the naughty little Tommy Briggs came rushing into the store, and he raced up to my grandmother, telling her that there was a monkey in a tree on the edge of the forest, and to come at once. My grandmother chuckled at Tommy Briggs. "You've not fooled me this time, little Tommy Briggs," she said. "Have they not taught you anything in school? We don't have monkeys here in North America. You can only find them in places like Brazil and in Africa, or at your local zoo, but definitely not in the woods out there, let me tell you that.
No, really, Miss Lollipop, I'm not lying. There really is a monkey in the tree, he insisted. I cross my heart. I hope to die. I'm not making it up. Please come now.
My grandmother sensed that Tommy Briggs seemed to be gravely serious, but just to make sure she was not being set up for another clever prank, she surreptitiously locked the door of her candy shop behind her and hastily manoeuvred her hefty body as fast as she possibly could, with her beads jangling precariously around her neck and her forehead breaking out into a sweat. She wobbled hurriedly across the dirt road towards the edge of the forest until she approached the large oak tree that Tommy was pointing towards.
Hurry, Miss Lollipop. If you don't get here quickly, the monkey might go, he said earnestly.
My grandmother looked up at the branches of a very large oak tree, and she told my mother that she actually saw a creature perching on a branch that looked like a monkey, but it wasn't a monkey, and it looked like a child, but it wasn't a child. But what on earth could it actually be? She couldn't imagine. My grandmother said the creature was very young, clearly only a baby, but incredibly intelligent and exceedingly alert, with deep-set golden eyes that stared down at them very, very curiously. My grandmother said that it was certainly as interested in them as they were in it. I gather it was covered from head to toe with very fluffy hazel-brown hair, and it didn't have a tail at all, as you would expect to see in a monkey. It did, however, have exceedingly long arms, and it was very small. My grandmother described it as having the most adorable angular face that she'd ever seen, with a very distinctive brow ridge, flat pug-like nose, and very small lips.
What kind of a monkey is it, Miss Lollipop? Asked Tommy curiously. It's different to the ones you see at the zoo.
I've no idea, Tommy, but go to the greengrocer and ask Mr. Braid to give you a pound of bananas and bring them here now. Don't tell him about the monkey we've seen. Just tell him that I'll pay him for the bananas later.
Why must we not tell him about the monkey? Asked Tommy.
For the time being, it's our secret, Tommy, and if you keep it like a good boy, you can have free candy for an entire month from my shop. Tommy knew that that was a really good deal. Free candy, he said, his eyes lighting up like a Christmas tree. Anything I like for a whole month. Yes, anything you like for a whole month, my grandmother assured him. So little Tommy did not tell anybody else about the monkey, but came racing back from the grocer's with a stash of bananas for the little critter. My grandmother peeled the bananas and handed them to the little creature in the tree in broken pieces because he was very small, and the critter grabbed them with his tiny hands and ate the bananas very gratefully. The creature was so cute and chattered continuously, but despite my grandmother's efforts, it wouldn't come down from the tree, and my grandmother was convinced it was waiting for its mother and that the tree was being used as some kind of a day nursery, but she wasn't too sure about that. My grandmother told Tommy to go home while she sat under the oak tree, waiting to see if the mother would actually return. She wanted to be absolutely sure that the critter was not stranded and would invariably be all right. She wasn't certain whether it was orphaned or abandoned, or whether the mother was actually coming back or not. It was only when darkness rolled over the valley did she hear the sound of heavy feet thundering towards the oak tree at a very swift speed, and stopping under the tree where the baby was hiding. Luckily it would seem that the dusky night was illuminated by a bright moon and a scattering of silvery stars. My grandmother was able to see a large silhouette of a very colossal humanoid being staring up at the oak tree and calling out to the little creature perched there comfortably in the tree branches. It called out to the creature in a chattering sound that my grandmother described as sounding like gibberish. And this strange chattering sound continued between the two creatures. The little creature reciprocated with the same chatter, looking down at his mother from a very great height. It suddenly came darting out of the trees rather like a squirrel, where it jumped onto its mother's shoulders with the agility and grace of a monkey, and sat there chatting away continuously. It seemed so delighted to be back with its mother, and was clearly very bonded to her. My grandmother realised that this was the little critter's mother, but she had absolutely no idea that she would possess the startling appearance of a humanoid ape. She described the creature as being colossal and exceedingly tall, with very burly muscular proportions and built to be powerful, speedy, majestic, lofty and strong. She said the creature was easily over 9 foot tall, 5 foot wide and 900 pounds. It was covered with long flowing brown hair that was not at all fluffy like her sprogs. It was a terrifying creature, my grandmother said, because you could tell that if it was aggressive, it would be exceedingly dangerous. It would take nothing for a creature like this to kill a human, because it was definitely an apex predator, easily in line with a lion and a tiger, with the added advantages of being exceptionally intelligent and discerning. The creature was twitching its nose awkwardly, and it seemed to have picked up my grandmother's scent, but that wouldn't have been difficult because she always smelt of lavender and talcum powder. The creature glided over to the corner of the tree where my grandmother was sitting. At this stage my grandmother was petrified, as the creature studied her intently, and she said in the darkness the creature's eyes possessed a very bright red eyeshine, which appeared menacing and disturbingly intimidating. She said at that moment in her life her fear escalated because she knew how protective mothers in the wild invariably are of their young. She said that the little creature sitting on its mother's shoulders tugged at the mother's hair on her cone-shaped head and started chattering away in her mother's ears. I think my grandmother was certain that the little sprog was telling its mother that she imposed no threat. That's how intelligent the little critter actually was. My grandmother said the creature gave her one last fleeting look, but did not display any obvious aggression towards her. It was almost as if the creature was saying, "Why are you hanging around my kid's day nursery? What is your interest in my kid?" It was almost as if she was trying to discern whether my grandmother had any nefarious intentions towards her sprog. When she seemed satisfied that my gran didn't impose a threat, she glided away faster than the wind, with the grace and stealth of a cheetah, and then she was gone. The next day my grandmother was so incredibly excited about what had actually transpired that she visited the local papers to tell them her extraordinary story, and that there was a primate living in North America in the woods that resembled a human. She took Tommy Briggs with her as a witness to confirm what they'd both seen in the oak tree. The young reporter was shaking so excitedly when he took down the details of my grandmother's story. "This is big stuff," he said exuberantly, and eagerly he proceeded to write the article. But his boss refused to let him publish the story, telling him that my grandmother wasn't right in the head and was making these crazy allegations up. My grandmother was bitterly disappointed not to be believed, and I gather even her own husband was cynical about her extraordinary claims. My grandmother said that one day a very strange, peculiar man entered the sweet shop. She noticed he wasn't local or from the area and appeared to be attired unusually smartly. She said he was wearing a black hat and a suit with a dark wrap-around pair of glasses that he refused to take off. When he spoke, his voice was rather raspy, with a non-definable accent. I gather he asked for a quarter of coconut ice and a quarter of licorice twists, and after he'd paid her for his goodies, he said the very strangest, most peculiar thing that caused my grandmother's hair to stand up on edge and for her heart to thunder through her chest like a heavy drum. "By the way, if I was you, I would not go spreading rumours about apes living in North America. I'd hate to see your pretty little candy shop go down in flames, wouldn't you? Or anything untoward happen to your husband of yours on that dairy farm." After that incident, my grandmother kept her mouth tightly shut and never ever spoke about the creature she'd seen again. But on 2 occasions she had red roses delivered to her sweet shop, with a note attached to it in a tiny sealed envelope, saying, "We're watching you," and that really freaked her out immensely. It was only after my grandmother died in that extraordinary hit-and-run accident that my mother told me the story, as she was wondering if the strange accident could have been connected to the threatening man who had surreptitiously paid her a visit in her shop under the guise of buying sweets. Could he have been the one driving the black car that violently ran her over? And why was he so intent on not allowing my grandmother to tell the locals about the ape-like humanoid that she had encountered at the edge of the woods? My mother tried to connect the dots, but it was difficult to make any sense of it. It was only in the year 2008, when there was extensive coverage on TV about a creature known as Bigfoot, that I began to connect the dots and realise that this was the strange creature that my grandmother must have encountered all those years ago. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Angelique and I'm from Oregon. My Bigfoot encounter happened in 2014 when I was 31 years old. I consider myself to be incredibly privileged and blessed because I grew up and still reside in an exquisite home that is perched on a rocky elevation that overlooks the Oregon coast and is literally 100 yards or so from a private beach with clouds of white sea sand and extraordinary sculpture-looking rocky outcrops, not to mention exquisite blue ocean with those foaming white waves that crash majestically against the rocks. Growing up, I adored the sounds of the tumultuous waves as they rose up in the distance, forming elevated hills of moving water that propelled themselves ever forwards until they flattened out into soft white foamy waves, until finally, with one last forward shiftful motion, the gentle water would glide across the sea sand, leaving behind pretty semicircular white frills, the indelible evidence of the footprint of a wave. I enjoyed the continued splashing motion of this interminable body of exquisite salty water. It was always the reassuring, steady background sound to our daily rituals. I found it enormously conciliatory and relaxing, and I also loved the taste and smell of the salty air and the feel of the cooling sea breeze blowing against my face. I loved nothing more than taking my 2 Irish wolfhounds, Lacey and Big Bear, for their daily run across the beach, and my dogs adored paddling in the water there and racing across the sea sand catching balls. I just couldn't envisage or imagine another life, because living by the ocean means the entire world to me. Our house had a look of the old and new married together to create a really delightful, sumptuous dwelling. It was designed by an up-and-coming architect that truly appreciated the beauty of historic architecture, but at the same time loved the advantages of modern contemporary designs. So he used this to maximise the panoramic ocean views of our home by introducing large seamless glass windows throughout, while at the same time ensuring that our home reflected the quintessential character so typically seen in older homes. I would describe our whitewashed house as a perfectly symmetrical home, with 3 stories, a grey slate roof, and symmetrical sliding windows and balconies on the higher elevations, while on the lower elevation or ground floor we have a very spacious, luxurious entertainment area with state-of-the-art barbecue equipment, including a stunning pizza oven, as both my parents are passionate cooks and are both in the hotel business. Our garden is filled with ubiquitous trees, such as the statuesque, rather imposing Port Oxford cedar, red alders, spruce and ash trees, and it has all kinds of ornamental grasses on display, not to mention some hardy, colourful roses and pots of beautiful flowering geraniums in bright pinks and reds that add that quintessential colour and beauty to our outdoor space. My peculiar story begins when I was working for a local budding and very promising up-and-coming company in Oregon for an amazing state-of-the-art, rather zooty product line which was being launched by our sales team. Some of our sales could be negotiated from the office over the phone via internet communication, or we could consult with clients at our glamorous offices on site, or then there were occasions we would travel to visit potential clients all over North America to promote and sell our products. Our sales team consisted of 30 staff members and, of course, our boss, who was a man called Hugh Evans. Now, Hugh Evans had only just procured the job as manager of our large sales team from his dad, who had handed down the reins of the business to his trust and care. The trouble with Hugh was he was incredibly young and immature, and he was taking charge of a team of skilled sales staff, easily 15 years his senior. Now, don't get me wrong, I haven't got any prejudice against young people taking charge if they are professional in their endeavours, but Hugh Evans was anything but. I remember he hired a young, pretty girl in our offices whom had no experience whatsoever in sales and literally didn't know a thing about how to string 2 words together when talking to our potential clients. But that wasn't significant at all to Hugh, as he had other ideas in mind as far as she was concerned. Before long, Hugh was engaging in a drawn-out love affair with the young girl in question, all under our noses. I cannot tell you the number of times I literally entered his office to have a word with him about something very important. I kid you not, there were women's clothes and undergarments strewn over the entire floor like a messy bedroom. As I sat down to talk to Hugh, he would be snorting as he tried to suppress his laughter, and his silly girlfriend would be giggling in the corner of the office, hiding behind the flower pot in a state of undress, almost as if she didn't know I knew she was there. It was very hard to respect a boss who engaged in such blatantly derogatory behaviour in front of his own staff. The men working on our sales team in our office found Hugh's conduct very objectionable, offensive and exceedingly embarrassing, especially when dealing with personal clients who visited our offices regularly. The last thing we wanted was our clients to see our offices turned into Hugh's love interest boudoir. "His father needs to know that his son is behaving like a Casanova," said Herbert. He was one of the salesmen in our team. "It's ridiculous, this kind of shenanigans going on during work hours. Such behaviour is hurting to our business and costing our sales big time. I have a young family to raise, and I can't afford to lose out on sales because of that selfish sod," he explained. Another thing I despised about Hugh's arrogant behaviour was the way he would cross his long legs out onto the gleaming oak desk in his grandiose office, even while he saw important clients. It really was repugnant and unacceptable behaviour for an up-and-coming sales executive. I'm pretty certain we lost customers due to his superior attitude that he continuously exhibited. One day Hugh offered our sales team an amazing sales incentive, which is often the case in a company where you're dealing with a team of ambitious salespeople that are eager to make excellent commissions. The big prize was a trip to Paris for two, to a very exclusive hotel, with all expenses paid and some spending money to boot. The prize would be attained by the salesperson that was acquiring the most sales and the highest sales figures by the end of the year. Everyone in our team was incredibly eager to win this prize, and no one more so than myself. I was utterly determined to win, and so much so that I worked harder than anybody else in the entire team. I went out of my way to visit clients, even if they were locally based, because I simply didn't want to lose sales as a result of Hugh's inappropriate behaviour in the offices. I also travelled all over North America, staying in different locations in order to acquire sales, and I communicated with people efficiently online and regularly even sold our products over the telephone. By the end of the year, I had reaped significantly more sales than the rest of our entire team, and it was only a matter of formality before I was finally presented with the prize to Paris that would be given to me at the office Christmas party, which was the usual custom. All my sales friends were so complimentary and genuinely thrilled that I had actually won, because they were such decent people who delighted in each other's successes. The Christmas party was being hosted, as was customary at the time, at a very smart, formal venue. This snazzy, idyllic location was also situated on its own stunning private beach, and was a grandiose, large white Georgian-style house with plenty of formal bedroom suites, including a personalised chef on hand, beauty salon, and every other conceivable luxury that you could envisage for a weekend retreat. I was incredibly excited and enthused that night, as I dressed in a classic, stylish black velvety dress with a silvery diamante trim. I visited the in-house salon to have my hair and nails done to perfection for the dinner and, naturally, the prize-winning presentation later on that night. I could barely wait, and all day my nerves were on edge as I contemplated the spectacular moment when Hugh would present me with my prize. I could barely wait. I cannot remember a time in my life when I was more enlivened with a feverish sense of excitement that was causing me to experience these butterflies flapping around in my stomach with a nervous energy. I had never won anything in my entire life before, and although I knew I deserved the prize, it was so wonderful knowing that I was going to be a winner tonight. I could envisage my trip to Paris with my boyfriend Marcus and the incredible romantic time we would inevitably have together, visiting the Eiffel Tower, the Arc de Triomphe, Notre Dame Cathedral, and so much more. I was so enthusiastic that I could barely eat the several courses of gourmet food that was being presented before me, but instead I fiddled with my knife and fork, barely eating a thing. "I can see you're excited," said my friend Tessa, squeezing my hand tightly. "But you deserve the prize, my girl. No one has worked harder than you have this year." "Thanks, Tess," I said. "That means a lot." Before long the prize-giving began, and I was shaking uncontrollably with excitement as Hugh raised a glass of bubbling champagne to toast absolutely everyone. "First, I want to raise a glass to the entire sales team and congratulate you all for an astounding good sales performance this year. And it's all thanks to your hard work, diligence and dedication that has moved our company forward with such phenomenal success and growth in sales. So well done to each and every one of you." Everyone began to clap and cheer and whistle and click their glasses together while sipping champagne. "Now I'm going to present the prize to the most inspirational salesperson of the year, which is the trip to Paris for two, with all expenses paid." At that moment my heart was in my mouth and I could barely breathe. This was the moment that I'd been waiting for all year, and finally it had arrived. All eyes were on me as Hugh announced the winner for the prize, and imagine my shock when he called out his own girlfriend's name. "Anna Maryland, would you come up here, please, to receive your prize?" I watched in horror as the giddy young girl giggled as she received the large bouquet of flowers, bottle of French champagne, and the air tickets to Paris that Hugh handed over to her. There was a stunned, awkward silence among all the salespeople as the beaming young girl took her prize gladly. All the sales team looked at each other in horrified awe. Surely this was a joke. In that moment I cannot describe how mortified I felt. It was like I'd been hit hard in the guts by a massive forklift truck, and that my whole being had been obliterated by the devastating collision, or in my case the extreme shock of these startling revelations that literally knocked my joy and hope away in a single blast. Could this really be happening to me? None of this was at all fair. It was exceedingly wrong. I staggered away from the table like a drunk, feeling the rising nausea welling up in my throat, and I knew I was going to be violently sick. I ran away towards the private beach, because being close to nature was my greatest source of comfort, and I knew being close to the crashing waves would invariably bring me the peace that I needed right now. Before long I was standing on the private beach and throwing up in a rocky alcove where the seawater washed over my feet with a gentle coolness. For a long while I hurled my guts out until my stomach ached from the physical exertion of trying to throw up on an empty stomach. For a while I paddled in the soft water, staring at the pretty foaming bubbles that caressed my feet gently, and enjoying the crashing sounds of the breakers thundering against the rocks. It was an exquisitely beautiful night, illuminated by a full bright moon and a scattering of silvery stars, and the outside lights from the venue's prestigious palatial-looking mansion only added to the intrigue. In the distance I could hear the sound of the DJ's drumming music, together with the excited, chattering, laughing voices and clinking of glasses and cutlery from all the outside glamorous decked tables. I sat silently on the beach alone, just staring at the ocean. For a long time I felt emotionally numb, as I reflected on all the weekends that I'd given up in order to win this incredible prize. Now it had been handed over to a silly girl who barely had made a single sale on her own, and she'd been given the prize as the most inspirational salesperson. It was an absolute joke if ever I saw one, and no prizes for guessing who would be benefiting from this trip. Hugh himself. Suddenly all the emotions overcame me and bubbled to the surface, rising and overflowing like a river that finally breaks its banks, as I began to sob and sob and sob. I didn't know that I was capable of spilling so many tears. The next thing I knew was that someone was throwing little pebbles at me, and I looked up to see a huge creature standing only yards away from me, and I realized almost at once that this was the mythical Bigfoot. I was so stunned that my tears instantly dried up. I kid you not that this critter was standing so close to me that I could have almost reached out to touch him with my hands. The strange, rather curious creature began to copy my crying by making all these sobbing movements that I had just exhibited, and he started wiping his tears with his forearm like I'd been wiping away my tears. His imitation of me was so incredibly hilarious that I began to laugh out loud. The creature enjoyed my response to his reenactment of me, that he promptly mimicked me all over again. But this time I was laughing so hysterically that it began to hurt my stomach muscles. The Bigfoot then started to copy my laughter, and by now I could not keep the bright smile off my face. This Bigfoot was a natural comedian, and he knew it. I kept wondering why this elusive, normally evasive creature was standing so incredibly close to me, and was so congenial and warm in his manner. I had listened to stories about Bigfoots before, and people appeared to have had some rather harrowing, dangerous encounters that had left them terrified by the creature. Others had searched for the elusive beast, and yet despite all their best efforts had failed to even gain an encounter. Here I was alone on a beach, and Bigfoot had approached me on his own terms. He had reached out to comfort me in a moment when my world had come crashing down upon me like a tsunami of grief. He had rescued me from my tears and put a smile on my face. Had he detected my grief, and had the humanity in him overcome his shyful reticence, and had he chosen to reach out to me at such a poignant time as this? I was certain that this was the case. I am now utterly convinced that Bigfoots can read human energy like books, and they're clearly creatures with compassion and extreme kindness when needed. The creature sat down yards away from me, as if we were both firm friends, and we sat there watching the coast. I got the sense that this critter came down to the beach regularly to view the ocean waves, and it was exquisitely beautiful, sitting so close to such a majestic, extraordinary creature, as if it was the most natural thing to do in the world. The Bigfoot was covered with long, flowing, exquisite-looking auburn hair, and was about 7 foot tall, 3 feet wide, and possibly 700 pounds. The creature was exceedingly large and burly, with very powerful-looking muscles and gigantic shoulders. I noticed it had incredibly long arms, often typically seen in the primate species, with extensively huge hands and feet. It had the typical cone-shaped head they often talk about when they describe Bigfoots, and a very long angular face with a prominent, deeply furrowed brow ridge and very deep-set dark eyes that were so kind and compassionate. The critter got up and waded into the water, trying to encourage me with his body language to follow him in. I shook my head, which he seemed to understand, but I watched him swim with the ease of a dolphin. He loved going into the deeper parts of the ocean and tackling those large waves, and he was so agile he'd have made a surfer look clumsy. He came out of the water and looked at me intently with bright golden eyes, and I watched him shake his shaggy coat of hair, spraying me with lots of water. I laughed and giggled as he showered me with the fine spray from his wet coat. For a second the creature disappeared, and the next thing I knew was he presented me with a very large, beautiful seashell that he'd found, and demonstrated to me that you could listen to the sound of the ocean from the shell by attaching it to your ear. Once the Bigfoot had gifted me with the shell, he nodded in my direction and glided away with an incredible grace. I was so sad to see him go. For a moment I sat there in a stunned stupor. Had that really just transpired, I wondered? Had I really encountered the mythical beast they called Bigfoot? I could hardly believe the incredulous thing that had just happened, and in that instant I realized that this incredible encounter with the elusive beast was so much more preferable than any trip to Paris could ever have been. Fast forward a week or so, and I was to discover to my absolute horror that Hugh had actually been sacked from the sales company by his own dad, and his girlfriend had subsequently also lost her job. I was to discover that several of my own sales team had visited Hugh's father spontaneously because they were so aggrieved that I had not received the prize to Paris. They informed Hugh's father about his son's abominable behaviour at work, and his father had been mortified about his son's lack of professionalism. I could not believe that my work colleagues had literally stuck their necks on the line for me with such a courageous, self-sacrificing act, because the father could have easily defended his son and sacked the sales team, but that never actually transpired. Instead, the father organised a surprise party for me, and I was finally presented with my prize to Paris after all that. To cut a long story short, I gather Hugh's father persuaded Hugh to enter the military, as he believed his son needed some knocking into shape and gaining some much-needed boundaries in his life, which wasn't a bad thing. I'm glad to inform you that my trip to Paris was a magical experience, but nothing was more memorable to me than my encounter with the hairy man. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Penelope and I grew up in the West Virginian countryside with my mother and dad and my older brother Nicholas, whom we chose to call Nick for short. Growing up, we had an idyllic childhood because we were such an incredibly close and loving family, and my parents raised us without imposing any expectations upon us. That was often the case with many of my peers, whose parents piled on the pressure for them to attain great grades in school and to aspire to becoming something very big later on in life. My parents would tell us the complete opposite. They didn't care if we swept the streets for a living or whether we danced for the Sadler's Well Ballet. All that they appreciated was that we were happy in our lives, and that was all that mattered to them. This meant growing up we felt as though we could truly express our own individuality without having our wings clipped. From a very early age, my brother Nick began to express a huge interest in flying. He was fascinated with all things that had wings, whether physical or mechanical, so he had a fervent passion for birds and for aircraft of all kinds. He was certain that one day he wanted to fly a Super Cub over Alaska and become a bush pilot, because he believed that the small size of the craft invariably meant that he would become like a bird flying in the sky. While Nick wanted to soar to great heights and fly like a bird, I wanted to remain very much rooted and grounded on terra firma, but I did not have an inkling what I wanted to do with my life, so I naturally envied my brother for being so certain about his future life path. We were both incredibly blessed to live in such an exquisite part of the world, where every morning I'd wake up to the most exquisite panoramic views over the imposing mountainous valleys, rugged rocky outcrops, and dreamy forests that literally flanked the far side of our property and seemingly stretched back for miles. I believe that some of it may well have been public-owned land, but it was always accessible to our family without any established boundaries, which was very fortunate. To access our home, you would drive down long paved driveways that were lined either side with vast areas of undulating lush green manicured grass, along with ornamental hedges and a scattering of large and small trees on the grounds. On the right-hand side of the valley was a silvery lake that was surrounded by imposing statuesque trees that stretched back into a large forest that was well maintained with hiking trails and footpaths. Our house was nestled in the centre of the valley on a slight hilly incline. It looked like a large pearl surrounded by clusters of green emeralds. We lived in a timeless, very large, square Georgian home, built with a rigid, regimental symmetry that you would invariably expect to find in a typical Georgian home. The building was exceedingly well built on solid foundations, with brick, stone and stucco, and with symmetrical windows and turquoise-coloured shutters. Our house possessed a very grand palatial entrance hall, which was accessed through a large archway that was framed by a very stylised pediments and columns that led to a bright turquoise wooden front door with a gleaming golden knocker. On the rear-hand side of our home, close to the kitchen and entertainment area, we had a very large tiled-covered patio area, which overlooked the most glorious lily-covered pond, and often at night when we sat out in the early dusk drinking strawberry daiquiris, a firm favourite with my dad, we would observe all kinds of animals coming to the water to drink, like raccoons and white-tailed deer. We were also privy to observing some phenomenal bird life. When I was about 15 years old, my mother asked my brother and I to go to the apple orchard, which was a short walk away from the pond, to collect some apples because she wanted to make an apple pie for dessert. "I think it's such a pity to waste all those delicious apples," she said, "so just look for the best fruit you can find." So my brother and I scuttled towards the orchard. I was carrying our picking basket in my hands. Suddenly we stopped still in our tracks. "Look," whispered my brother. "Over there. Can you see it?" "What is it?" I whispered. "I've absolutely no idea," said my brother. That was when we saw the strangest sight that I've ever observed in my entire life. A large humanoid creature was sitting on the ground with its hairy back facing away from us, and with a very long arm was holding small pieces of bitten apple and feeding them to a little sprog that looked only a little larger than a tiny toddler. It was the cutest thing that I've ever witnessed, and even more adorable than a human toddler. She was cradling her precious, very expressive sprog in her powerful legs as she fed it pieces of apples, and once it had eaten its fill, she rocked it lovingly in her arms backwards and forwards, and began to whistle to it in a way that sounded rather like a bird. It was a very pretty sound. My brother and I stood frozen to the spot, like solid ice statues, so fearful that the creature would observe us and run away. Suddenly I carelessly dropped my basket on the ground, and the creature quickly turned around and stood up. Her golden brown eyes looked shocked to see my brother and I just standing there. For a moment all was very silent and still, as we just stared at each other, locked in what I can only describe as a silent stupor, as no one made a sound. The creature was obviously female, and was about 7 foot tall, 600 pounds, and 3 foot wide, and she was covered with long flowing golden blonde hair, and I personally thought she was very beautiful. The creature was sinewy, muscular, and powerful, and she had the most impressive shoulder muscles that I've ever observed before, and a distinctive bullet-shaped head. Her face was very human-like, with a brow ridge and deep-set, lively golden eyes. The gorgeous little jovial sprog was much more auburn and darker in colouring than its mother actually was, and its hair was also finer in texture. It pointed towards us with its tiny overlong arms and minute little hands, and it made a very strange chattering sound, almost as if he was asking its mother what we actually were. It seemed remarkably intelligent, on the ball, and very alert and sharp for something so young and tiny. Suddenly we heard my mother walking towards us, asking what on earth was keeping us so long. I could literally have killed her in that moment, because the creature looked utterly terrified and startled when it heard my mother's voice approaching us. It dashed swiftly through the orchard at a lightning speed, like a cheetah on the wind, with her sprog firmly cradled in her loving arms. We watched in wondrous awe as she glided away with such extraordinary, seamless, majestic grace. I can honestly say that I did not feel an ounce of fear in the presence of this awesome, mighty, and incredulous beast, the likes of such that I've never encountered before. Sadly for me, the encounter was far too short-lived, but the gentle, stirring, and loving energy the creature exuded will stay in my memory for a lifetime, like a priceless treasure that will never, ever be forgotten. "What on earth has got into the two of you?" snapped my mother. "Standing there, looking as if you've both seen a ghost? What on earth is going on with you both? I asked you to pick me some apples. It's not complicated, but you're just staring there blindly into space in a complete dawdle. I'm better off doing these things myself, honestly." As we helped my mother gather some apples for her pie, Nick whispered to me and said, "Sis, this is our secret. We're never to tell anybody about this. Understand? Pinky promise." We both clinked our pinky fingers together in an agreement. "Pinky promise," I agreed, and I was so thrilled to share such an amazing, awe-inspiring secret with my brother. When my brother and I were far away from the prying eyes of my mother or father, we would ask ourselves over and over again what this strange, marvellous and phenomenal creature we encountered actually was. We'd never seen or heard of such an anomalous creature ever existing in North America before. When my brother was older, he finally left home to settle in a remote part of Alaska, which is quite literally a 13-million-acre park of awe-inspiring wilderness. My brother told me where he was living was so off the beaten track that it was about 100 miles to the nearest road, so invariably travelling by plane was his only viable option. My brother learnt to fly the Super Cub under the super instruction and guidance of a phenomenal bush pilot known as Rodney, who recognised at once that my brother had a natural flair for flying because he also possessed that raw gut instinct that was required in flying this extraordinary Jeep of the skies. My brother told us that flying his bright red Super Cub over vast areas of tundra, imposing snow-capped mountains, volcanoes, glaciers, coastline and waterways was like strapping on a pair of wings and becoming like a bird. He said he felt such joyful elation and such incredible freedom soaring in the skies like a majestic golden eagle. I gather he never ever landed on proper runways, but instead on mountain tops, river bottoms, sandbars and beaches. It didn't get better than that, he told us. My brother also told us that the Super Cub was actually built in the 50s by a man called Mr. Piper. I gather that no one has been able to trump the Super Cub, although there have been natural modifications to the craft being made over the years, like the addition of large tyres that have made the plane much more safe. Sometimes my brother referred to his Super Cub as being like a magic carpet because he could literally land in parts of the wilderness where no man has ever been before, which made my brother feel like a pioneer, explorer and adventurer. Naturally, while my brother was embarking on following his solo adventures across the Alaskan wilderness in his Super Cub, our family invariably missed his jovial, fun-loving presence around our home. But we were so excited that he was finally returning home for Christmas, and we could barely wait to see him again, because we had not been in his company for over 9 long months. "We must get the place very festive for your brother," my mother insisted, "and I'm going to make sure we have all his favourite treats on the dinner menu." I could see that my mother had an animated look on her face as she sang happily to herself all day. I knew she could barely wait to see Nick again. Our family was bustling around for Christmas, decorating our home with a very large Christmas tree that looked like a great work of art, with its red, gold and green baubles and red ribbons, along with the intricate wooden decorations which I believe came all the way from Germany, including a massive angel that graced the top of the tree. After all our exciting Christmas shopping, we had finally laden our Christmas tree with tons of spectacular-looking presents, all marvellously presented with extravagant ribbons and bows and exquisite paper wrappings that I couldn't wait to tear open. I had spent a lot of time under the tree trying to figure out what some of the strange, anomalous parcels addressed to me actually were. I couldn't wait for Nick to return home and to open my present that I'd purchased for him, which was the most tiny little ornament of a bright red cub plane, and I knew he was going to love it. Suddenly I heard my mother's phone ringing, and I watched her as she calmly answered the phone. At first she seemed serene, and then I noticed her face took on a pale greenish pallor, and her eyes grew round like saucers, and then she threw the phone down and began to scream, "No! No! No!" I picked up the receiver. "Who's there?" I asked. "What have you said to upset my mother like this?" "Sorry, I didn't mean it to come out like that," came the voice. "I'm Rodney. I taught Nick to fly the Super Cub. I don't know if he's told you about me." "Yes, I know who you are. What's going on?" I asked. "I regret to have to inform you, but your brother's had a very, very bad accident in a remote wilderness area of Alaska. He's missing, presumed dead." I could not listen to any more of this horrifying conversation, so I also dropped the phone on the floor, where it crashed to the ground with a mighty clang. I could hear the startled voice on the other end of the line saying, "Hello? Hello? Hello? Is anybody there?" My heart was pounding in my chest like a heavy drum, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through every fibre of my being. I wanted to scream, cry, or hit something as hard as I possibly could. I could feel my stomach muscles churning violently and curling and twisting and folding into knots, and I could feel the bitter taste of bile rising up at the back of my throat. I felt nauseous, sick and overwhelmed by an immobilizing grief that paralyzed my emotions into a stunned stupor. My mother was sobbing her heart out, and I was walking around the place like a zombie. And when my dad heard the horrifying news, I heard him punching the boxing bag in the gym so hard that it almost came off its hinges. I could see by his vacant stare that the revelation of Nick's death had hit him very hard indeed. None of us were taking this grievous news of Nick's death well, as you can imagine. It transpired after the crash that the Alaskan authorities believed that Nick's body had been evacuated from his plane by a grizzly bear and subsequently devoured, which meant we didn't even have a body to bury. I cannot put to words to describe the level of grief that hit our entire family, and I do not believe I'm exaggerating when I say it hit us so hard, like a major volcanic explosion, and literally shook our entire world apart. The next morning it was Christmas Day, and snow had fallen overnight, turning the grounds on our property into an enchanting and magical winter wonderland. It looked like the quintessential most perfect Christmas, and the panoramic snow-covered views were utterly exquisite. I remember thinking that this Christmas was an irony of ironies, rather like a rose with very sharp piercing thorns, so exquisitely beautiful, and yet hauntingly painful all at the very same time. My mother was trying to be very upbeat and positive. Nick would have wanted us to have had a good Christmas, she insisted, as she bustled around busily in the kitchen, preparing the turkey and all the trimmings, and I knew she was keeping herself preoccupied to numb and suppress the agonizing pain. We sat down at the table and my dad began to carve the turkey. None of us said a word. Despite the delicious smells and aroma of the Christmas food, from the cinnamon to cloves and crisp turkey, I truly couldn't envisage myself eating a single thing. My appetite had just vanished and disappeared, and I was certain I would never feel hunger again. Suddenly we heard a familiar warm voice. "Why, such a morgue! On Christmas Day! I know that I, for one, would love some of that delicious-looking turkey, Mum." Nick was standing there at the table, looking at us with a broad beam on his face. For a while we thought we were seeing a ghost. "Nick, is that really you?" gasped my mother, dashing into his arms. "Oh, my poor baby," she said. "I thought you were dead." Suddenly our home became light and airy, filled with joyful laughter and happy chattering voices. "This is the best Christmas ever," I said, my eyes welling up with tears. "My brother was lost and he's found, was dead and he's alive." Later that day I gave my brother the present I'd brought him, and I expected he loved my little model, the Super Cub. "It's beautiful, Sis," he said, marvelling at the little plane. "It's just like the real thing." He looked at me with a jubilant smile and said, "Remember our pinky secret?" he asked me. "Of course I do," I said. Well, when I crashed my plane, it was in an area that was filled with lots and lots of trees, and one of those hairy creatures came out of those trees and pulled me out of my Super Cub, because I was really, truly stuck in there. It literally bent back the record of the plane. That was how strong it was. And even though I was suffering from a mild concussion, I could see this creature very clearly, and it quite literally saved my life, because if I'd remained trapped in there, I would have been a sitting duck for a grizzly bear or some other predator. The hairy humanoid took me to a cave in a mountainous valley and watched over me the entire time until I finally came around from my concussion, and that was when I was able to finally call for help. "Did it look like the creature that we saw in our orchard?" I asked. "Almost identical, only I believe it was male, and it didn't have that auburnish hair, but it was more brown in colour. But I was so concussed, I was able to observe very few details." "Wow," I said, "that creature actually saved you? I can hardly believe it. You promise you're not making this up?" "Since when have I ever lied to you, Sis?" "Since never," I said. "Exactly. So now do you believe me?" "Well, of course I do. I'm just amazed, that's all, because that creature we saw in the orchard, it was so quiet and shy. I can't believe it had the courage to just help you like that." "I can't answer that question. I wish I knew." "So this is our pinky secret number 2, said my brother, taking my pinky finger into his, and then we saluted. "Well, it's a Christmas miracle," I said, beaming. "That it is, Sis," said Nick, giving me a hug. "That it is." All these years later, we do not know what caused my brother's supercat to suddenly lose its power in the sky, because he was a phenomenal, incredible pilot. But I do know this for a fact, that this was very definitely the best Christmas of my life, and I'm eternally grateful to the Alaskan creature that I now know to be a Bigfoot for saving my brother's life. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.